The first time most of America heard this story, it didn't start with a body. It started with a phone call. A grandmother in Orlando, Florida, dialed 911 and said something that would echo for years. She said she had found her daughter's car and that it smelled like a dead body had been inside. Then she said her granddaughter, 2-year-old Caylee Anthony, had been missing for a month. A month. In the space between those two facts is the reason this case still hits people like an electric shock. Not just because a child was gone, but because of the time it took for anyone to tell the police she was gone. Tonight, we're going to walk through the Caylee Anthony case the way a careful juror is supposed to. Slowly, chronologically, with a hard line between what's confirmed, what was alleged in court, and what remains unknown. Because if you only know the headlines, this case feels like a simple story. But if you follow the evidence, it becomes something else entirely, a lesson in how uncertainty works, and how the justice system is built to live inside it. Here's the central question, and it's the one we'll keep returning to. What happened to Caylee Anthony? And right behind it, the question that shaped everything. Why did it take 31 days to report her missing? If you're here for surface-level outrage, this won't be that. But if you want the most complete, evidence-focused, victim-centered walkthrough I can give you in one sitting, consider subscribing now. Near the end, we'll return to the piece most people argue about, the verdict, and I'll explain what the jury could and couldn't legally do with what they were shown. Before anything else, we need to talk about Caylee. Caylee Anthony was born in August of 2005. She was a toddler when she died, an age where a child is still becoming a person in the world, still learning what safety means, still believing that the adults around her will always be there. Family members described her as affectionate, energetic, and deeply bonded to the people who cared for her. She loved swimming. She loved Disney. She was, in the simplest and most important way, a little girl who deserved to grow up. Caylee lived in the Orlando area with her mother, Caylee Anthony, and often spent significant time with her grandparents, George and Cindy Anthony, in their home. Caylee was a young single mother in her early 20s. The household, by many accounts, carried tension, arguments about responsibility, money, and independence, but also routines that revolved around Caylee's care. This matters because the story that follows isn't just about a courtroom. It's about a family system, and the case can't be understood without that context. Now we move to the timeline. Caylee Anthony was last seen alive on June 16, 2008. That date is one of the anchors in this story. In court and in investigative summaries, June 16th becomes the pivot point, the before and after. What is confirmed is that after June 16th, Caylee was not seen by her grandparents again. She did not appear at home. She did not show up at familiar places where people would reliably notice her. And no report was made to law enforcement until July 15th. Between those dates, June 16th and July 15th, is a stretch of time that the public often describes as incomprehensible. And during trial, that gap became a battlefield. The prosecution used it to argue consciousness of guilt. The defense used it to argue dysfunction, panic, and a different kind of cover-up than murder. But we can't jump to theories yet. We have to build what's known. In the days and weeks after Caylee was last seen, Caylee Anthony told her parents variations of the same story. Caylee was with a babysitter, someone Caylee called Zani. The name Zani, and the claim that Caylee was being watched by this person, became one of the most infamous details of the case. Investigators eventually concluded that Caylee's statements about this babysitter were false, and a major part of the state's case was that Caylee invented a caretaker to explain Caylee's absence. Caylee also made other statements in the early investigation that were later shown to be false, including claims about her employment. Those lies mattered because they weren't just small inaccuracies. They were verifiable, and detectives were able to prove they weren't true. And ultimately, those lies became the only charges the jury agreed were proven beyond a reasonable doubt. We'll get there, but before we do, we need to understand how the family realized something was wrong. By mid-July 2008, Cindy Anthony, Caylee's grandmother, became alarmed. According to reporting and testimony, Cindy had not seen Caylee in weeks. When she confronted Caylee, she didn't get a coherent, verifiable answer. Cindy found Caylee's car and believed something was deeply off about it. Cindy then made multiple 911 calls on July 15th, and in those calls she reported Caylee missing and described the odor in the car in graphic, emotional language. That 911 audio became a major piece of the public narrative, not just because it's dramatic, but because it captures a family crossing a threshold, a private crisis turning into a criminal investigation. Here's a question to hold on to as we move forward, because it's one that jurors and viewers often wrestle with in different ways. When you hear the urgency in Cindy's voice, what does it do to your assumptions about everyone involved? I want you to sit with that. If you have a theory right now about Caylee, about George, about Cindy, notice it. Don't lock it in. Just notice it. And if you want to leave a comment with what you believed before you learned more about the evidence, and whether your mind changed as this story unfolded. Now, the case begins to accelerate. After Caylee was reported missing, law enforcement interviews with Caylee Anthony became urgent and extensive. Caylee told investigators that Caylee had been taken by the babysitter, that she had been searching for her, and that she knew who had her. But as detectives checked Caylee's claims, they began to collapse. One of the clearest examples involved Caylee's claim that she worked at Universal Studios. Detectives drove with her to the location. They asked her to show them where she worked, and it became evident, in real time, that she had lied. That moment is frequently cited because it's a rare thing in an investigation, a lie unraveling in front of the person who told it, with nowhere to hide. From an investigative standpoint, that changes the posture of an interview. It shifts a person from possibly uninformed to actively deceptive, at least on specific points. And in the court of public opinion, it cemented an image. Caylee as someone willing to lie easily, even when the stakes were her missing child. But here's what's important. A liar can still be telling the truth about certain things. And a person who lies for one reason can lie for another. The question in this case was never, did Caylee lie? That part was provable. The question was, what do the lies mean? As the search for Caylee expanded, investigators also focused on physical evidence. A critical area of attention became Caylee's car. The vehicle had been left at a check-cashing business parking lot and was towed to an impound yard in late June. Later, family members and investigators described a powerful odor associated with the car, particularly the trunk area. This part of the story is emotionally loaded, and it's often recited as if it's a single, definitive fact. But in court, it was treated as what it actually is, evidence that must be interpreted. Law enforcement and forensic personnel described the odor as consistent with decomposition. Cadaver dogs reportedly alerted to the car. Forensic testing was performed, and the results were debated. The prosecution argued that this was a sign Caylee's body had been in the trunk. The defense argued that the odor could have come from other sources, including trash, and challenged how conclusive any of it was. That argument about conclusive becomes a theme in the Caylee Anthony case. Again and again, jurors were faced with evidence that felt suggestive, even powerful, but that experts argued over in terms of certainty. As weeks passed, the case shifted from a missing child investigation to a homicide case, though at the time, Caylee's body had not been found. In October 2008, a grand jury indicted Caylee Anthony on charges including first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and aggravated manslaughter of a child. The state's theory was that Caylee was killed and that Caylee concealed the death, misled her family, and lied to law enforcement. But the defense was building a different story, one that would later detonate in court, that Caylee died in an accident and that the family's response was shaped by fear, secrecy, and dysfunction. For a long time, the public heard that and thought, how could that be anything but a desperate lie? And yet, in court, desperate stories sometimes succeed, not because they're true, but because they exploit the space where the prosecution can't prove its own story. So now we reach one of the most important developments in the entire case. On December 11, 2008, Caylee Anthony's remains were discovered in a wooded area near the Anthony family home. The discovery was made after earlier searches in the general area had not located her. The location, close enough to feel haunting, became another permanent fixture in how people remember this case. Investigators recovered remains and items from the scene, including duct tape associated with the remains. The medical examination that followed could not determine a precise cause of death due to the condition of the remains. The manner of death was ruled homicide by undetermined means. That phrase is clinical. It doesn't satisfy the human need for an answer. But legally it matters because without a known cause of death, the prosecution's narrative has to stand on a structure of inference. An inference can be strong, but it can also be attacked. Now, to understand why the trial ended the way it did, we have to talk about what the prosecution needed to prove, and what they chose to prove. In a first-degree murder case, the burden is heavy. The state must prove not just that the defendant caused the death, but that it was done with a particular state of mind, premeditation, depending on the jurisdiction's legal definitions and the charge. In this case, the prosecution's narrative included the idea that Caylee was killed intentionally, and that the method involved substances like chloroform and acts like suffocation, with duct tape as a component. They pointed to internet searches on the family computer as part of the story. But here's where the ground gets shaky. Digital evidence was contested. The interpretation of what was searched, when it was searched, and who performed the searches became disputed territory in court. The prosecution presented evidence that chloroform had been searched, and at various times in public discussion, the number of searches and how they were counted became a point of controversy. The defense challenged the significance and the accuracy of how those searches were represented. This is not unusual in cases where computer forensics enters the courtroom. The public tends to think of digital evidence as clean and absolute. The courtroom reality is often messy. Timestamps can be misread, software can interpret cached data in confusing ways, and the difference between a search and a visit can become the difference between a narrative that feels damning and one that looks inflated. And for jurors, inflation is dangerous. Because if jurors feel even one major point is overstated, it can poison their trust in everything else. That becomes a silent force in deliberations, not just the evidence itself, but the credibility of how it is framed. Now we need to step back and look at Caylee Anthony in the period between June 16th and July 15th, because this was another pillar of the prosecution's argument. During that month, witnesses testified that Caylee socialized, spent time with friends, and behaved in ways that did not match what many people expect from a parent with a missing child. That includes the now famous tattoo Caylee got during that period, Bella Vita, often translated as beautiful life. In the public imagination, that tattoo became a symbol. For many, it felt like a confession of indifference. But in court, a symbol is not proof. It's interpretation. The prosecution used Caylee's behavior as circumstantial support. If Caylee were missing and Caylee were an innocent mother searching desperately, why behave this way? The defense countered with an argument that Caylee was psychologically compartmentalizing, that she lived in denial, that she was a person trained to hide crisis behind normalcy, and that her family dynamics helped create that pattern. When people hear that defense, they often respond with anger. It can sound like excuses, but the job of defense counsel is not to satisfy moral intuition. It's to find uncertainty and expand it. And in this case, the defense didn't just expand uncertainty. They tried to replace the entire narrative. At trial, Caylee Anthony's defense asserted that Caylee drowned accidentally in the family pool on June 16, 2008. They alleged that Caylee's father, George Anthony, was involved in what happened next, either as someone who discovered the event or as someone who helped conceal it. The defense also introduced allegations of prior sexual abuse by George, which George denied. Those allegations were never proven in court as facts, but they were deployed to explain Caylee's behavior and to reframe the family dynamic as one shaped by hidden trauma and deception. This is one of the hardest parts of the Caylee Anthony case to speak about responsibly, because allegations of abuse are profoundly serious, and so is the reputational harm of airing them without proof. So here is the careful way to hold it. The defense claimed these things. George Anthony denied them. No criminal charges were filed against George Anthony in connection with Caylee's death. And the jury was not asked to determine whether George committed abuse. They were asked to determine whether the state proved Caylee committed murder beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction is not just legal, it's ethical. Now, as the trial approached, the case was already a media storm. Jury selection was moved away from Orlando due to the intensity of local publicity. The trial itself drew extraordinary attention. Every day became a public event, with legal arguments dissected like sports commentary. But inside the courtroom, the rules were different. Evidence had to be introduced properly. Witnesses could be cross-examined. Experts could be challenged. And jurors were repeatedly told to ignore outside commentary. In a case like this, the most dangerous gap is between what the public believes it knows and what jurors are actually allowed to consider. The public saw the case as a story. Jurors were forced to treat it as a series of proofs. So what did jurors hear? They heard about Caylee's lies, and they heard about investigators reconstructing timelines through phone records and witness statements. They heard about the car and the odor and the forensic interpretations. They heard about the remains and the duct tape. They heard competing expert testimony. They heard arguments about internet searches and what they meant. They also heard from Caylee's family. George and Cindy Anthony were not distant figures in this story. They were living inside it. And in court, their testimony exposed something that matters in long-form truth. Families can fracture into multiple versions of reality under stress. People reinterpret the same events differently. They remember differently. They defend themselves differently. This is especially true when the stakes are unbearable. At different points, Cindy Anthony attempted to account for digital evidence on the family computer, claiming at one point that she had searched for certain terms. Prosecutors presented rebuttal evidence that challenged that claim, including work records suggesting she was not home at the time she said she made the searches. Whether you interpret that as Cindy lying to protect her daughter, or Cindy confused and overwhelmed, or something else entirely, the impact is the same. The jury saw that even within the family, truth was unstable. And instability favors the defense. Because the defense's goal is not to prove an alternative story is true. It's to show the prosecution's story cannot be proven. So now we arrive at a crucial concept. one that true crime audiences often talk around without naming. Reasonable doubt is not possible doubt. Anything is possible. Reasonable doubt is doubt that remains after you consider the evidence honestly and still cannot reach certainty. Some viewers hear that and think it's a loophole. It isn't. It's the barrier that prevents a society from taking someone's freedom or life based on emotion, assumption, or incomplete proof. But in a child death case, especially one drenched in public anger, that barrier can feel like a betrayal. And that's why the verdict in this case struck so hard. Now, before we get to the verdict, we need to examine the specific weaknesses the defense exploited, because this is where the trial becomes more understandable, even if it remains emotionally difficult. First, the cause of death was undetermined. That means jurors were not given a single definitive medical explanation of how Caylee died. The manner was ruled homicide, but the mechanism could not be established. Without mechanism, the prosecution's theory, chloroform, suffocation, duct tape as an instrument, became something they had to persuade jurors into accepting through circumstantial alignment rather than direct medical confirmation. Second, there was no confession and no eyewitness. Third, the prosecution's narrative relied on connecting multiple pieces of evidence into one coherent story, an evidence mosaic. Mosaics can be powerful, but if jurors decide one major tile doesn't fit, they may question whether the picture is real or imagined. And fourth, the defense introduced an alternative narrative that, whether or not jurors believed it, provided a route out of certainty. The drowning theory placed Caylee's death in the category of accident and the concealment in the category of panic and dysfunction, rather than premeditated murder. In many cases, jurors don't have to believe the defense story to acquit. They only have to believe the prosecution did not prove its own story beyond a reasonable doubt. That is often the most misunderstood point in American trials. Now let's talk about how jurors might have experienced the case in real time. Imagine being a juror listening to weeks of testimony, much of it technical, some of it emotional, some of it contradictory. Imagine being asked to weigh expert against expert, interpretation against interpretation, and to do it while knowing the entire country is screaming for a particular outcome. The prosecution's challenge in the Caylee Anthony case was not just evidence, it was narrative discipline, because in the court of public opinion, Caylee Anthony was already guilty. In court, the prosecution had to prove not just that Caylee died, not just that Caylee lied, but that Caylee committed first-degree murder, and that is a specific mountain. Now we arrive at the moment when many viewers lose patience and want to jump to the ending. But the ending only makes sense if we hold one more uncomfortable truth. Behavior is not forensic evidence. People grieve differently. People panic differently. People lie for reasons that aren't the reason we think. And sometimes, a person can be morally culpable in the public eye and still not be legally convictable. That is not a defense of anyone. It's a description of how the system works. Now, with that foundation, we can move to the climax of the courtroom story. On July 5, 2011, after deliberating for roughly 10 hours, the jury returned its verdict. Caylee Anthony was found not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter, and not guilty of aggravated child abuse. The jury found her guilty on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. There is a difference between not guilty and innocent. Not guilty is a finding about proof. That distinction is cold comfort to people who feel the truth is obvious, and it is agonizing in a case where a child died. When the verdict was read, outrage was immediate. It was national. It was enduring. Many people experienced it as the system failing. Others saw it as a system doing what it was designed to do, refusing to impose the harshest penalty without the highest certainty. So now I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly for yourself. If you were a juror and you believed, emotionally, that Caylee Anthony was responsible, but you were not certain how Caylee died or exactly what happened on June 16th, would you convict on first-degree murder anyway? That question is the heart of this entire case, and your answer tells you something about what you believe the justice system is for. If you want to share your view, tell me, do you think jurors should ever convict on a charge as severe as first-degree murder if the cause of death is undetermined? Why or why not? After the trial, Caylee Anthony was sentenced on the misdemeanor convictions. The judge imposed consecutive sentences and fines, but because Caylee had been held in jail for years before trial, she received credit for time served. She was released shortly after sentencing in July 2011, and that release became another flashpoint, because for many members of the public, it felt like she was walking away. This is the part where the story could end in a wave of anger. But I don't want to end it that way, because anger isn't analysis, and it isn't justice, and it doesn't honor Caylee. So instead, we need to talk about what remains unknown, because that's where this case truly lives. We do not have a court-validated account of how Caylee died. We do not have a full, verified explanation for the 31-day delay, beyond Casey's shifting claims and the defense's framework. We do not have a verdict that offers closure in the way people often want closure. What we do have is a child who is gone, a family permanently ruptured, and a public still wrestling with how to hold uncertainty without breaking into extremes. Because that's what this case does. It pulls people toward absolutes. Some people insist the case was proven, and the jury got it wrong. Some people insist the prosecution overreached, and the jury did what it had to. The truth is that both things can hold elements of reality at the same time. The prosecution may have had a strong suspicion of what happened, but the evidence may not have met the burden for the charges they pursued. And that is the risk prosecutors take when they go for the maximum charge. If the jury can't reach certainty on the top count, you may lose everything. So what does the Caylee Anthony case teach? If we strip away the spectacle, it teaches that lies are not the same thing as proof of murder. It teaches that a narrative that feels emotionally correct can still fail under cross-examination. It teaches that forensic evidence is often interpretive, not absolute. And it teaches that public certainty can become a kind of pressure that has nothing to do with what can actually be proven in court. That last point matters beyond this case, because it's part of why high-profile trials are so dangerous to cover irresponsibly. When people treat outrage as evidence, they stop caring about the standards that protect everyone, even the people they love. Now, I want to bring us back to Caylee one more time, because it's easy for her to disappear inside the argument. Caylee was not the body found in the woods. She was a child who laughed, who played, who trusted. When people talk about this case, they often talk about Casey. They talk about George. They talk about Cindy. They talk about prosecutors and defense attorneys and experts. But Caylee is the only one who had no voice. Caylee's life was the real loss here. Caylee's absence is what every argument is circling. And that is why, even if you believe the verdict was legally correct, you can still feel devastated by it. Because legal correctness is not the same thing as emotional resolution. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with responsibility. The responsibility to speak carefully, because defamation and rumor don't create justice. The responsibility to avoid turning a child's death into entertainment. And the responsibility to keep a clear line between what is known and what is assumed. Here's what we can say, without speculation. Caylee Anthony was last seen in mid-June 2008. She was reported missing in mid-July 2008. Her remains were found in December 2008 near the family home. Caylee Anthony was tried in 2011 and acquitted of the most serious charges. She was convicted of lying to law enforcement. And Caylee never got the kind of answer that ends a story cleanly. If you've stayed with this all the way through, thank you for giving a difficult case the time it requires. If you're new here and you want more long-form investigations that prioritize evidence, context, and respect over outrage, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. And I'll leave you with one final question to carry out of this story. What would justice look like in a case where the truth feels emotionally obvious to millions, but the legal proof cannot reach certainty? If you want to answer that, tell me what you think justice means here: punishment, truth, prevention, or something else entirely. However you feel about the verdict, Caylee Anthony deserved to be safe. She deserved to grow up. And remembering her means refusing to let noise replace truth.